can the Ukraine army, as it currently sits, continue to fight effectively until all the negotiations get worked out?
Well, effectively, no, but it can continue to fight. In other words, people can continue to stage insurgent warfare against the Russians as long as you continue to sustain them with cash and weaponry. You can still send over MLRS rockets, and you can still roll out the MLRS and shoot into Russia. This is another reason why I want to stop it, because I don't think we should have anything to do, should never have had anything to do with anything designed to kill Russians in Russia. In fact, I was one of the people early on that said, people like Lindsey Graham or Romney, others that were celebrating the deaths of Russians were idiots.
I want to tell you and your people, you're the ally I've been hoping for all my life. Not one American has died defending Ukraine. You've taken our weapons and you've kicked their ass. And I'm very proud to have you as our ally.
They should be censured for saying such stupid things. We need to get out of that mindset 100%. So my view is we should just cut it off, because that means Russian lives are now at less risk. When that's clear that there is no longer any support, the vast majority of Ukrainians that are still in uniform fighting will stop. There will be some hardcore holdouts. There always are. We even found that in Germany towards the end of the war, and we rounded them up and shot them. And that put an end to it. But they were less than 1%. The overwhelming majority of German soldiers were happy to go home. The overwhelming majority of Ukrainians will be happy to go home. So I think that's true. And I think it will happen. So the sooner we end this aid, that'll really end killing. Yeah. And that's really what I think President Trump wants to do.
Yeah, it is, and that's whatever's going to get to the end the fastest, so we can get on to the rest of living and security architectures that will keep everybody safe, Russians, Europeans, and Americans. That's really the objective here. But one of the roadblocks to that, you mentioned this a minute ago, is the globalist mindset, and we were talking about some of the Europeans, but some of those are on the American side, and one of which is somebody you may have heard from, a guy named David Petraeus, has this little gem of what he suggests the White House should do next.
There has to be a security guarantee. I can't imagine that Ukraine could agree to anything that did not include a robust security guarantee. The question is, what could be in it? Just beyond a military response, could it include, for example, automatic seizure of the $300 billion of Russian assets sitting in European banks? Could it include an automatic path to NATO membership for Ukraine? All of this in addition to whatever the military action might be taken by probably a coalition of the willing. In an ideal world, it would be a NATO operation led by an American 3-star, let's say, with a core headquarters that is then built into a NATO coalition headquarters with lots of European and U.S. assets.
No, that was, I couldn't, I had to watch the video a second time before we decided to put it on here to see if I heard it right. Here he is, Petraeus is saying in an ideal condition, in the best case, it's going to be a U.S. NATO core operation with the U.S. military 3-star in charge of this, tied back to Brussels. What planet is he on again?
Well, he's trying to breathe life into the comatose body of NATO, first of all. Let's keep that in mind. Secondly, the empire, those imperial advocates on the Hill will love this, because anything they can do to maintain our presence in Europe over the long term is a feeding opportunity at the public trough. More money is then washed through the system and ends up in their pockets. All the think tanks in Washington would welcome all of this. I mean, what are you going to do at the Atlantic Council pretty soon? I don't see much future for it. They're not happy. So the Atlantic Council goes out of business. What's the Brookings Institute going to do? They love to sit around and fantasize about all these kinds of peacekeeping operations and, permanent intrusive headquarters that are going to somehow dictate and nation build and all this nonsense. I think he's out of touch with reality, but then I've thought that for a long time.
And as you see there, Gary showing that headline there, that I mean, Lavrov said no European troops, absolutely no chance that they'll be completely unacceptable. And I want to get back to this point because many will say, well, that's just part of negotiations. They have to give on something, and our side has to give on something, but we'll come kind of in the middle. But as you see the power dynamics play it out here, Doug, does the Russian side have to give in on this, or can they just keep fighting until they take it all by force?
They can do the latter, but they don't want to. And if you listen carefully to what President Putin has said, he's talked about the oblasts that are occupied now by the Russians that have Russian populations. He's also interested in Kherson and Zaporozhye, if for no other reason as a matter of security. I still think that the Russians will want Kharkov because Kharkov is very close to Russia. It is historically a Russian-speaking city, and I don't think they want that to fall back into the hands of the Ukrainians for fear of what they might try to do with it. I mean, let's be perfectly blunt. I wrote an op-ed when this whole thing started, and I tried to say that from our standpoint as Americans and NATO, what happened east of the Dnieper River was not a matter of great strategic importance to us. That part of the world east of the Dnieper was historically had little to nothing to do with the West. Everything from Kiev to the West was ruled for centuries by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and ultimately the Kingdom of Poland. And it was when these institutions, these Polish-Lithuanian alliances fell apart, that the Russians essentially advanced into the vacuum, which of course we would have done as well. The second part that I think we need to understand is if the Mexicans had been organized and equipped and trained by Russians to build a great army to invade Texas, Mexico, and Arizona, and they had gone into these places and killed 100,000 Americans, how would we react to the collapse of that foreign force as it was driven south of the Rio Grande? Would we compromise and say they could have half of Arizona, or would they demand that, or would we demand that we're going to continue to control everything to the Rio Grande? I think we'd stick with the Rio Grande. So I would be prepared for something more from the Russians than what they currently have. I can't predict it. And I'm sure the Russians will come to the conclusions very carefully. You'll have the general staff on one side, the foreign ministry on the other, and the people in commerce who are worried about future business and so forth. And they will put together something that is for negotiation. Because remember, what the Russians want out of all of this, along with us, is normalization. Remember from the beginning, we've talked about this. I said, Putin wants to do business with the West, not fight it. That's still true. And so under those circumstances, I think there will be give and take, but I can't predict what that will be. But you can't give too much as a Russian on the east side of the Dnieper because you will be viewed as a traitor. You could be removed from power. The Russian people that have suffered these losses are not going to be open to too much give. So it has to be carefully metered. From our standpoint, it's back to what I said before. What happens east of the Dnieper has never been of importance to us. Never. By the way, when the original Barbarossa invasion plan was developed, the German general staff wanted to advance to that river line and stop. They weren't fools. It was Hitler that drove everybody further east. So, in World War I, if you look at the war between the Germans and the Russians, once again, they stayed well to the west. They weren't interested in these vast open areas. There's nothing militarily or strategically for us to gain by advancing into those areas. So we need to be very flexible, but I think if we are flexible, the Russians will be forgiving in the sense that, remember, we have been pushing this war against them. And if I'm right, then I think you'll see something more reasonable than everything from the Dnieper to the east is Russian. It'll be something other than that. I don't know what it will be.
Yeah, it certainly remains to be seen. Certainly lots. I've been reading in some of the Russian military review and some of the other Telegram channels where there's lots of voices given that if for exactly the reason you said there, that Russia has spent 100,000 of their own troops on this that are dead, about 250,000 or maybe more that are actually wounded as well. And they say that's not going to, they're not going to be satisfied with just freezing the line where it is right now and keeping what they have. They want, the security of there. So, but you're right. There are multiple competing power centers in Russia. It's not just a monolithic kind of dictator like we like to characterize it. So we'll have to see how that plays out here. But one of the last questions I want to ask before we let you go here today is as we talked about at the start, the European side has still been thinking it's just going to be status quo from the Biden era, and they didn't want it to change, and they were, quote, shocked when Trump said some of these things here. But there was a big emergency meeting in Paris yesterday that 8 of the European leaders got together, and they really didn't come out with anything. So apparently there's not even consensus even among those 8. So the question is, once this gets settled, however it ends up getting settled, how effective do you think President Trump is going to be to bring Europe back into line to where there's some sort of unity between the West and the United States?
I think that it would probably be useful, if we haven't planned to do it, for Mr. Witkoff, Mr. Rubio, those two in particular, to fly to Berlin, and from Berlin to Paris, and from Paris to London, and personally brief the people there on what was discussed, what we accomplished, and where we want to go. I think that would help a great deal. So I hope that happens. That's the way you bring on the European side and get them to understand that this normalization between us and Russia is now going to happen. And if President Trump does that, if he pursues this normalization, he lets the Ukraine war settle, stops the funding, pulls us out, and lets this thing sort out on the ground, and does what I just suggested, send Rubio and Mr. Witkoff to Berlin, Paris, and London for discussions, I think that he could end up with a Nobel Peace Prize for bringing peace to Europe. So I hope that will be seriously considered, because that's the way you move forward. You don't want to rush anything. It all has to be deliberate. But let there be no mistake, this is Donald Trump in charge. And let's tell Zelensky to shut up and go away.